Stacie, you work with imagination and perspective in fiction, films, novels, etc. For fictional characters to have imagination and to exist in the world that they do, they obviously have to be conscious in their simulated world. So what I want to try to do is to understand the consciousness that characters have in fiction and see if we can infer from that ideas about what consciousness is in real life. So what can we learn from characters, the consciousness of characters in fiction, that might give some different insights into what consciousness is for us in this setting?
Well, consciousness in fiction, particularly since the 19th century novel, at least in the West, has been a major subject of fiction itself. So getting inside the minds of fictional characters is something that we find far more in fiction for fairly obvious reasons than we do in nonfiction. And there are a variety of methods that authors use to give us insight into how people are thinking. Sometimes we get internal monologue. Sometimes it's given to us in free and direct discourse. And in all of these cases, we at least certainly get the feeling that we're getting some kind of inside view of what's going on in someone's mind in a way that we cannot get in our ordinary interactions with other people. And of course, whether or not we are gaining genuine insight turns on whether the author has genuinely captured something about how people's minds work.
Right, so we're seeing it obviously through the author.
Exactly.
The author is projecting it into different characters, so we have a nesting of multiple perspectives that are going on here. And what are the ways that we can use that multiple perspective nesting to ascertain ascertain the consciousness of the author or the author's understanding of what consciousness is?
That you can see this, I think, in different authors' styles, their way of presenting consciousness. So Henry James is famous for using what he called centers of consciousness. So all of his characters are looking at the world. You're getting it in Jamesian prose, but you never get direct, omniscient descriptions of what the world is like. What you get is what the world is like, say, Paris, through characters' perception of it, say, Strether in The Ambassador. And in those cases, what you get is a sense of how the author thinks the world would look to a person of this kind, how they would respond to things. And later, of course, in modernist literature in the early 20th century, you get much more stream of consciousness, where there's a kind of attempt to articulate what the blooming, buzzing confusion that William James pointed out.
What are some other examples?
Some other examples, there are really interesting cases of, I guess you'd call them postmodern, more recent novels playing with all of this, right? So in a novel like The French Lieutenant's Woman, the author who presents themselves as a kind of character writing the very thing that we're reading comments on how he could let us know what was going on in such and such character's mind, but that he'll resist the urge because it'd be more interesting to try to figure it out for the reader. And so you get authors playing with it in that respect. I'd say when you go to much earlier works, so prior to the 19th century moving to realist novel, you get much more first personal kinds of works where you get, say, Moll Flanders, for example, or Tristram Shandy, where you get something almost like a stream of consciousness, but it's much more organized and much more in the author's voice than you get later.
How about James Joyce's stream of consciousness?
James Joyce, I was thinking of Virginia Woolf, but James Joyce, that kind of stream of consciousness is exactly what I mean, where there's this attempt to put into words, to convey the way in which thoughts tumble after each other, the way in which they're associative instead of logical. They don't follow a normal causal structure.
Right. And that might not even be the way that the person was actually thinking, but using those words, but it expresses the feelings that they had as opposed to the literal words they were thinking in their minds.
Exactly. And I think going back to your earlier question, I mean, how does that give us insight?
Yeah.
I think it doesn't necessarily give us insight directly. It doesn't give us, oh, this is what happens to people's minds. What really happens is that we evaluate this representation of the mental relative to our own experience. And you, I'm sure, have engaged with fictions where there were characters who were totally psychologically implausible and unrealistic. So we are fairly decent at making determinations of whether this matches with something in our experience. Not literal transcription of thoughts, but the feeling of having these thoughts coming one after another, and especially when one is, say, anxious or upset or emotionally engaged.